Hi, I'm Dr. Frank A. Thomas, and this is another installment of the African American Preaching Legacy series, where we bring you the very best in African American preaching. And today we have Dr. Carolyn Ann Knight, my classmate, my comrade, my sister. She and I have been together over 30 years, and what she knows about preaching, we're going to try to unfold some of it for you. And so I just thank you for taking the time to come and being with us. And I'm excited to have you. We've been planning this for a while, and I'm glad it has happened.
Well, thank you, Dr. Thomas, for having me. It's my delight, my honor. I know that you value this series highly, and that you have been bringing in the very best in the African American preaching tradition. So I don't know what I did to be included in that number, but I am grateful to be included in that number. I guess if you live long enough, you get a certain status, and I've certainly lived long enough. So I thank you not only for including me, but for the seriousness with which you take preserving the African American preaching tradition. I believe that generations yet unborn will be the rich beneficiaries from what you're doing and what you're depositing in the repository.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. You know, it's an honor to have you, and just the rich history and the legacy and all the knowledge from teaching preaching to doing preaching from around the country, and D-Man, all that you bring to the table. So it's our honor to have you. So I think I'd like to start just to, tell me about your call.
I always start off by saying it wasn't cataclysmic. It was more progressive. I was born and raised in Denver, Colorado. My father was a member of Union Baptist Church. My mother went to Mount Carmel. We were really a one church, but a two church family. My mother went to Mount Carmel, and we went to Union with my father. And the pastor, the first pastor I heard was John T. Walker, who was to date would be in my top 5 of preaching. And I was always attracted to his preachment. And so children's church, Sunday school, none of that meant anything to me. I couldn't wait till the 11 o'clock hour to get to hear John T. Walker. And everybody thought I was they were always like, what's wrong with this kid? What's wrong? And they didn't have any disciplinary problems with me. I would sit like on the second, third row. You couldn't sit on the front row because that was where the deacons sat, and all the deacons were men. So, but I would sit there, and I would just sit there as straight as I could, and I'd absorb every word. He was a marvelous, what we would call narrative preacher, storyteller. And at 8, I gave my life to the Lord, was baptized, and then I waited till my 12th birthday, and I said, I want to be a preacher like Pastor Walker. Now, before I could tell him that I wanted to be a preacher, he passed away. So kind of sent my 12-year-old self into a little quandary. And really just kind of floated from church to church. I was in the choir singing on the usher board. And in Denver, what you did, you just go from church to church, church to church. I landed at Mount Gilead Baptist Church. And at 12 years old, told the pastor there that I wanted to be a preacher. I didn't know anything about putting it in theological or biblical terms. I just said, I want to be a preacher. I want to be a preacher. And he told me that women did not preach. So from 12 to 16, I started exploring other occupations, maybe medicine, maybe law. And actually was enrolled in a program at the University of Denver, Colorado, for African American students who had a chance at being college material, and went there really as a pre-med major. And I heard a woman at our church, her name was Mae Buchanan, and they didn't call her reverend, didn't let her preach from the pulpit or anything. Called her Sister May, actually. But she preached a sermon in every sense of the word. And I said, I'm going to be a preacher. And I just kept sitting on it. And finally I said, I'll find somebody who will. And I found M.C. Williams, pastor of New Hope Baptist Church. And I went to tell him that I wanted to be, still no theological or biblical language. I just want to be a preacher. I just want to be a preacher. And he said, well, if you want to be a preacher, you've got to go to Bishop College. And almost within 2 weeks' time, I left the program at the University of Colorado and was enrolled and headed towards Bishop College. And ever since then, I've learned what it means to be a preacher. So there was no, God didn't have to push me or prod me, I just kind of volunteered, and God said, okay. But I knew from just listening to Dr. Walker, the importance of words, the importance of words. I learned from him the importance of words, using words correctly. And I also learned the value of education. He was the first pastor I saw with the 3 bars. And when I came to find out that meant he had an earned PhD. And so I learned those 2 things from him. And I really, really feel that I would have learned so much more if he had not passed away. But here it is all these years later, and he is still perhaps the most singular influence on what I try to do even now as a minister.
Tell me about your bishop experience.
Well, Bishop was, as you know, known for producing, as we say, preachers. And that is still our legacy. Bishop College was a land grant college that started in Marshall, Texas in 1881. And they moved from Marshall to Dallas, and that's where so many of us joined the Blue. The Blue. Bishop was challenging. Now, M.C. Williams factors into it greatly, because at the time there were no women in the religion department. I would be the first. I would also be, we have women who were majoring in Christian education, maybe 1 or 2, but I would be the first. And I tell people, I say, I'd be the first one who was out as a professional preacher. I mean, I landed on the campus as a preacher. I was there as a preacher. And so a lot of groundwork had to be laid, So M.C. Williams called Milton King Curry, who was our president. Milton King Curry called Harry S. Wright, who was the dean of the chapel. Dr. Wright called Dr. Mangrum, who was the chairperson of the religious department. And then Dr. Mangrum eventually called me. And he said, you'll be welcome here. There won't be any problem. You'll be expected to be, what did he say, a student of the same caliber that we expect all of our students. And so all of this has been done, you know, to kind of get the fellas ready that a woman was coming. And so here I come. But here's the thing, Frank. At the time that I went to Bishop College, I was also running amateur athletic track. And I actually came to Bishop from representing the USAA, United States, I think it may have been the Penn Rally, the Penn State relays, but it was a major track meet, and at that time my uniform was ablaze with USA red, blue, and white. So I think I kind of through the fellas, because I think that their image of a woman preacher was that I was going to be long skirt, big Bible, you know, with a whole bunch of religious pronouncements. And yet here I come, like I say, USA tracksuit, Puma running shoes on. So they didn't quite know what to make of me, you know. But it was an interesting experience. I made some friends right away, some preachers didn't just gravitated to me right away, and I still very, very dear friends. On the other hand, there were some who they were not going to move on the issue of women preachers. But I can honestly say, and I've said this in other interviews, I did not experience verbally or visibly any hostility. I mean, nobody got in my face and said, you don't belong here, women shouldn't preach. Now, I don't know what they said in the dorm. I don't know what took place in the dorm, but I know in my presence, there was no hostility, there was no rancor, there was no confrontation. And I don't know if that's because they had been put on notice by, you know, and that they were afraid that MC Williams might show up at any moment. I don't know if that was what was fueling it, but I did not have any confrontation with one person in the religion department. A lot of them wanted to talk to find out, you know, what I was about, what I was gonna do, but no hostility. And as a matter of fact, I've shared this in other interviews as well. There were 3 that just, if you paid them, they wouldn't believe in women preachers. If God came down and told them, they would not believe in women. But when I graduated from Bishop College, they became perhaps some of my nearest and dearest friends. Wow. And unfortunately, all 3 of them as I sit here, all 3 of them have passed away. But I mean, we kept in touch. And as far as I know, they passed away. They went to see the Lord without changing their mind on women preachers. And they became pastors, never invited me to preach, but would call me on the phone and we talked long hours. And so it was that kind of dynamic. I was very studious. I did not do a whole lot. I went from class to the library, to the dorm, to the cafeteria. I went to church on Sunday. Sunday, you had to get back early because, you know, the cafeteria closed at 2 and that was the only meal, you know, so if you were going to eat on Sunday, you had to get back to the cafeteria. But so I was pretty basic. I think in my sophomore year, I wanted a little job because I wanted some money in my pocket. And but I took my classes. went to class, went to.
So what did Bishop contribute to your preaching?
Bishop contributed a lot to me overall, as not just my preaching, but just Denver was pretty diverse. Pretty diverse. We had people from on my block. We had people who lived in Germany, Russia. We had Hispanics, you know. So, and in school we were pretty diverse. Bishop was my first all African American experience, pretty much. In Denver, most of my teachers, I think I may have had one black teacher in Denver, but all of them, you know, so it was my first exposure to a volume of PhDs. I mean, everybody at Bishop had a PhD. And I didn't know any of that. You know, I really did not know the educational trajectory. I knew that you graduated from high school, you went to college. Mm-hmm. But I didn't know about the next steps. I didn't know about the master program. I didn't know about, you know, so I learned all of that at Bishop. That there were steps to education. And I knew because I saw it, and I saw it at a very high level at Bishop. The quality was of such a status that it made you want it to, and so it made me want more. Bishop created in me, I would say, a thirst for education. I mean, I tried my best to read every book in Bishop's library. I tried my best, not just the religion books. I wanted to read every novel, fiction, nonfiction. I just wanted to read. And I literally lived in the library. People would say, "You're looking for Carolyn Knight. She's in the library. She's in the library." She said, because I just, you know, I went, like I say, went from class to the library, back to the dorm. And so Bishop created in me, I mean, as I think about it now, you know, just to want to be the best at what I do and bring the best and to be my best self. I grew up a lot there because even though, you know, I was there, you know, the fellows were down the hill, and I was, so the people in the dorm were not really people I was in class with, you know, so we couldn't share the dynamics of class. But, and then we had Religious Emphasis Week. We had the L.K. Williams Institute, where preachers from all over the country would come. And so I was exposed to the best in African American preaching. Now again, they were all male, but it was still the very best preaching anywhere on the planet. I mean, they brought in the best. And so we heard Charles Sampson, we heard Frederick G. Sampson, we heard, you know, just Bob Wilson, Caesar Clark, Lloyd Blue, E.K. Bailey. We heard the Wades. We heard Manuel Scott. You know, just so many. We heard Gardner Taylor, of course. Sandy Ray was a regular. And so we were exposed to just the best preachers on the planet. We heard the guy at Wheat Street, Williams Homes Borders. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that was a marvelous experience to hear him and the way he shared with us, because they would preach in chapel, then they would have to come and spend time with us. And Williams Homes Borders was just because he was just larger than life. And he talked to us about Martin Luther King and what it was like to be in the movement, to be in Atlanta. And so we had that kind of exposure. But what we got in the classroom, I mean, we did the work. It was absolute scholarship. So that when I went to seminary, and this is true of 3 of us went to the same seminary, we were put in advanced classes. We were put in advanced classes because of what we learned at Bishop College.
Where'd you go to seminary?
We went to Union Theological Seminary in New York. Wow. And we were put in advanced classes.
So tell me about your experience at Union.
Well, I went to Union because at Bishop, I learned that that's what Bishop preachers did, for the most part. If you graduate from Bishop, and it was unofficial, it was not written in stone, but if you went to Bishop, you went to Union, because M.C. Williams did, William J. Shaw did, Al Campbell, they all went to Bishop. And they went to Union for seminary. So it got to be the kind of unwritten rule that was a seminary trajectory. If you went to Morehouse, you went to Colgate Rochester, of course. And so I went to Union, and I was so excited to be in New York. It was a city like I had never experienced before. And we got to Union, and we got to Union at the right time, because Cornel West had just gotten there. James Melvin Washington had just gotten there. James Alexander Forbes had just gotten there. Dolores Williams had just gotten there. Sam Roberts in sociology had just gotten there. So here we were at the seminary where Tillich taught. Reinhold Niebuhr, Karl Barth, all those guys had been there. Dietrich Bonhoeffer had been there, but their ghost still haunted and still loomed large in the seminary. So, and again, I chose Union as my seminary of choice, not only because of Bishop, but because I read that they had the best theological library of all the schools. So I said, that's where I want to be. Plus it's in New York City. So I got there, and Cone was there before all the others.
I was going to ask you that.
He was like the they were after hires, but I actually went there at Cone's invitation. He had come to Bishop, and I talked to him. But I got there, and the first class I had to take was Introduction to Philosophy of Religion. And into that room stumbles this young guy. I mean, I don't think he was 3 years older than I was. And big afro then, black 3-piece suit, even then. And he just, without note or paper, just went on for about an hour. And I mean, you talk about absolutely smitten. And of course, I knew his name was Cornel West, but the Cornel West aura wasn't. But it didn't matter to me. I literally, I attached myself to him that very day, and never. I mean, we're friends to this day. I literally would follow him around the seminary. I mean, I had never been exposed to a mind like Cornel West. And it was just transformative for me. And then to get him and James Melvin Washington together, 2 of the most brilliant people that I have ever known. And like I say, I literally would just, if I saw them coming out of the door and going up Broadway, I did in step with them, and they never said weird. I went right along with them. I leaned into their conversations, and then of course for me, I was fortunate enough to have a friend, Emil Thomas, who I met at Bishop, and he was one of the ones that we were together with. It was Emil, David Kelly, and myself. We went from Bishop to Union. And Emil was at Canaan Baptist Church with Y.T. Walker. And he took me over and introduced me to Y.T. Walker. Well, Y.T. Walker had just been at the Progressive Baptist Convention, which met in Denver that year. Who did he meet? M.C. Williams. Mm-hmm. M.C. Williams says, well, my daughter's going to be at Union, so Wyatt already kind of had heard about me. So I just kind of kept hanging around Canaan. And Wyatt said, well, you want to hang around here and see what we can. So I started out as an intern, then moved up to youth pastor, then moved up to associate pastor, and then he made me the assistant to the pastor. And I stayed there for 10 years. So Harlem was just a wonderful experience. Wyatt and I were, Wyatt's activism, being with Martin Luther King, and they were closing the Sydenham Hospital, which was right around the corner from the church. Very important hospital for African Americans, very important. So Wyatt and I went to the protests, and next thing I know, I'm meeting Calvin Butts. And sat there and talked to Calvin Butts for a few minutes. And the protests had largely been on the outside because the hospital was already closed. But Butts, being who he is, he said, I'm going inside. Well, you go inside, you're going to get arrested because you're really trespassing. But I looked at Wyatt and I said, I'm going with him. And I followed Butts and ended up following him until he passed away. So just wonderful, wonderful, wonderful experiences. Canaan Baptist Church was the best laboratory that I've ever had. Gracious, praying people, patient people. Wyatt let me do everything, had me do everything, from sitting in to official board meetings to baptizing. He didn't care how big the men were. He said, you're going to have to baptize them. And he taught me how to take them down and let them come back up on their own.
So tell me about preaching. Tell me, in the history, you are just a matriarch in the preaching of African American women. So, how did the preaching acumen develop at these places? I'm assuming Canaan, Union. Bishop. Somewhere your preaching began to elevate. So tell me about that.
Well, I want to show some humility in this, but when I started talking to God and praying about it and just getting off by myself and talking to God and listening to God, I told God from the very outset that I would do my very best. I would do my very best. I would, for one, I was and still am, and I hope I can say this without crying, just so thankful. When you think of all the people that God could have called, and God called me, and I did not bring anything to it. I was running around in Denver, And like I say, I didn't know Bishop existed. I didn't know you. I didn't know any of these things. My life was in Denver and would have been in Denver had it not been for the divine intervention of God and for God putting God's hand on me. And so I was and still am just so grateful. I mean, somebody calls me now and invites me to preach, and I just say thank you, God, for every opportunity. For me, it is a privilege to do this. It is, and every time I think of all the choices, God, all the millions and millions of people, so I committed to it almost from day one that I was going to be the best. I was going to, and like I say, I'm trying to be humble about this, but I said nobody was going to out-study. I was going to study harder, study longer, pray longer. I was going to read more. I was going to be prolific in my reading. I wanted to, give God my very best. And then, on the other hot side, there's a humanist too. I was down there with all these guys who, there was a lot riding on me being able to demonstrate that I could write a sermon and deliver a sermon. And so I felt that if I didn't elevate it, it's sort of like being African American. We carry the weight of the whole race on our shoulder. And at that time, I literally felt that I carried the weight of future women in ministry, because if I failed in my endeavors, they wouldn't just say Carolyn Ann Knight couldn't preach. They would say they would use me as a litmus test to say that's why God doesn't call women to preach. Yeah. And so I wanted to make sure that didn't happen, that was not the case. I did not want them to be able to be the role model for why people say, see, God doesn't call women to preach. She couldn't even write a sermon. She couldn't even deliver it. She couldn't even put, So I had that always, even now, a part of that. Even now with the large proliferation of women pastors, women preachers, and excellent women preachers, there are still people who will hear one bad sermon delivered by a woman and say, that's why God doesn't call women to preach. So that was the commitment I made to be the best. And then again, exposure to Charles Adams, Fred G. Sampson, and as I moved away from and started hearing Sam Proctor, Gardner Taylor on a regular basis. And then some women, I began to hear Yvonne Delk and so forth, and Barbara Williams with Trinity, was that her name? Barbara. And I began to hear women who were excellent preachers as well. So, but the commitment to be the best that I could be was always there.
So you just gave me kind of preaching, because my next question was preaching mentors. So who would you consider you just kind of listed some of them already to me, so I may be redundant, but just want to double check.
Well, Charles Adams was absolutely the best preaching mentor for me, and here's why. Again, I'm at Bishop College. Nobody at Bishop used the manuscript. And I didn't know any other way but to write the sermon out fully. And, and then here I'm surrounded by preachers my age that just stood flat-footed and just preached. And So I had this angst about manuscript, no manuscript. Well, during Religious Emphasis Week, here comes Charles Adams. And he preaches Sermons in the Flesh from John, the first chapter, verses 1 through 14. And he uses the manuscript. He's just moving paper, and to use our vernacular, just killing everything in the chapel, just killing everything, and just manuscript, man. And not only that, but his language, and just, and so I said, that's it, that's it. I said, he is the spiritual obstetrician who presided at my birth to manuscript preaching. And so then I became, whenever Charles Adams was in town, I would get to hear him and see how he used the manuscript. Then when I got to know him, I got him to show me how he folds the manuscript and tears it in half, manages it and puts it in his Bible. I started doing that. So Charles Adams for sure. Fred Sampson, M.C. Williams, in terms of language, just in terms of being able to use that lofty language, which was so important. It's not as important now, but it used to be to use that high, vaunted pulpit language. Like I said, it's not as important nowadays, unfortunately. And then there were some women who were not preachers. Barbara Jordan was very much around at that time. And I just loved everything about her. Never got to meet her, but that was one of my goals, to get to meet her. But she was a very, very important role model for me, as well as Shirley Chisholm, because these were women who could command large audiences, command their attention just by their words. So, yeah.
So how do you prepare a sermon?
Ooh. If I can convey one thing to the next generation, preaching is hard work. It's hard work, and it saddens me that we have I won't say a generation, but we have some preachers who just do not see the hard work that must, I don't say may, must go into preaching if you're going to craft and deliver a sermon that transforms the very lives of people. When I was at Canaan and I knew I was going to preach with some regularity, I used to be able to plan my preaching out. But I always start with Scripture, for the most part. I always start with my text. I figure if I can get my text in my head and get my text absorb it into my spirit, then I have some running room. So I live with the text. I live with the text for at least a couple of days, because I have to read it and read it and read it, and until I literally feel it. And then I start asking questions of the text, making notes of the text. I'm preaching a sermon now that I've been dissuaded from. When I looked at the text, I immediately wanted to call the sermon "Shut Up and Move On." And I asked a preacher friend about it, and he said, now we wouldn't expect that from Dr. Knight. So I said, well, in my focus group, he was my focus group of one, it didn't land well. So I called the sermon something else. But I kept reading in different translations, and the Message Bible actually says, God will fight for you. You need to just stand still, keep your mouth shut, and move on. Exactly what I want to preach. So the next time I preach that sermon, I'm call it "Shut Up and Move On." and I'll just use the Message Bible. But you would never get that just looking at one translation. So I'm more proficient in Hebrew than I am Greek. So I read the Hebrew when I read the Hebrew. When I'm working on a Hebrew Bible passage, I work with the Hebrew. Then for me, the sermon doesn't make sense unless I can connect it to the context. And that's not to say that I sit around and wait for something to happen. But just there's enough in the daily comings and goings of life that you ought to be able to really connect your sermon to the contemporary context. So for me, that's very important. How will this text, this ancient biblical text, resonate with this contemporary context? Now, often, and certainly in these last few years, there's been enough in the headlines to just preach. But Dr. Proctor would always say, you don't want to be sitting around waiting for something to happen when there's enough. Somebody's always got a child that's misbehaving, or a spouse that won't do right, or a bill that can't get paid. How do these biblical texts speak to what people are actually going on? So for me, I want to have a sermon that resonates with where people really are. And then I like to envision the people. I was like, Brother Jones, Sister Smith, will this reach the teenagers? Will this reach the young adults? Will this even impact senior citizens, because you want to be able to preach in such a way that you throw a wide enough net that something you say will reach everybody, will touch everybody. Even if the little kids come up and just say, I like the way you talk, You want to get something out of your congregation. So that's what I do. I ask questions of the biblical text. What does this text say? What does it mean? What did it mean then? What does it mean now? What's going on in the community? What's going on with the politicians? That can be worked in the sermon. What is God up to in this text? What is the theology of the text? What is the theological language of the text? And then I try to apply it to their lives. I don't want them to just be listening to me to be listening to me. I remember asking William Sloane Coffin in my homiletics class at Union. I asked him, I said, when you preach a sermon, what do you expect people to do? And he said that if I preach a sermon about beating swords and the pruning hooks and spears and he said, I expect them to go out and do that. And then, of course, Martin Luther King did the strategy was that, he would preach and then they would march. He would preach and then they would vote. So that is something that is very profound for me. And that can be either prayer, tithing. It doesn't have to be social action, but, you want people to respond to your preaching. They say a thing in the AME church, when you come to the altar rail, kneel in prayer and go out to serve. And so you don't want people to remain the same. You don't want people to remain, you want your sermons to be transformative. And that's what I try to, get people to do. And I have to target for transformation. Because if you don't plan for transformation, it doesn't happen automatically, It doesn't happen automatically. So the sermon has to be crafted and written and delivered in such a way that transformation will occur.
So give me a time when as you look back to all these years of preaching, when it was most difficult, the situation that it was really hard to preach. So tell me,
I felt the weight of preaching when my mother died. I flew from New York to Denver, and I forget his first name, but he was at New Hope, Peters. That was his last name, Dr. Peters. I flew into town to bury my mother. And I flew in on a Thursday, and the funeral was, I think, that next Tuesday or Wednesday. And in between, you have a weekend. So he calls me and says, and shares his story about how therapeutic it was for him to preach, you know, in between burying his father, I think it was. And so he asked me to come preach at New Hope. And I said, well, let me call you back. And I talked to my cousin, Frank, and he said, I think you should do it. And I went and preached, and it was hard rising from my seat. You know, I didn't, you know, as we always say, I had a sermon in my bag, so it wasn't like I was preaching anything new or anything that I was not familiar with, but it was hard to rise from my seat. But what helped me to rise from my seat was a saying that I always told my students: do not preach what you're not willing to live. And at that time, because I was at Canaan and in New York and had become very familiar with funerals and had, you know, held the hands of people around the passing, and I knew the words that I said to them. And what helped me to get out of my seat at that time was when those words, my own words, came back to me. Do not preach what you're not willing to live.
Yeah, yeah. So let's go to the other side. So when was the time that, you know, God really used you to you thought that it was just, this is the best of preaching? I mean, just to be used of God. And
now, I hope that I'm not sounding like I'm trying to dodge the question, but honestly, I'm still waiting on that moment. Now, having said that, there are some times where I've preached some memorable sermons. As a matter of fact, I'm preaching this Sunday, and the pastor had literally requested that I preach a sermon that he heard me preach years ago, not just 10 years ago, but years ago. And he's literally asked me to preach that sermon. So I've had moments where I preached some sermons where I was pleased with them, and the people were pleased with them. I've had some moments where I've written some sermons, and I knew they were good sermons. But what I want God to do in me hasn't happened yet. I'm still on this journey, and I hope that God and I are getting near that point where. Now, I'm not saying that, you know, I don't think God is not pleased with the effort and the commitment and things, but for me, what I want to give, you know, we use this phrase all the time, usually at funerals, when we say, servant of God, well done. Now, for me, I believe that that is something that only God should say. So when people say that to me, and they may say it to me when it comes my time, but I don't want to hear it from you. I want to hear it from God. Yeah. And so I'm still working for that moment, for that sermon, where I know God will say, servant of God, well done.
Tell me about the Hampton stage.
I have been on the Hampton stage 4 times in a speaker-presenter capacity. I was on the Hampton stage, the smaller Hampton stage, Ogden Hall, when I read the scripture before women, you know. But in 2000, Dr. Walter Scott Thomas invited me to be the morning preacher. And it was a great experience. It was a wonderful experience, but nerve-wracking. You know, because, you know, as you know, they asked you the year before. At least they did at that time. And so you're living with it the whole time. And what are you going to preach? What are you going to preach? What are you going to preach? But the best advice I received was from a friend of ours, and I don't know if I'm letting the secrets out, Hampton secrets, but Dr. Freddie Haynes said, Freddie called me and said, don't get up there preaching anything new. He said, you get up there and you write your sermons out, write them, make them Hampton specific. He said, but don't get up there trying to work out new material. He said Hampton's not the place you want to work out new material. So I did. I have 4 sermons that I had preached. And you know, you can do it now. You can't do it nowadays because you could do it then, but you can't do it now because social media, you know, you go viral, you're streaming people, you know, so you get one place and they've already heard it, you know, but back then, you know, you could preach it and get it road ready, get it Hampton ready. But to me, it's a wonderful experience. Also, though, I feel it's an experience that you only need to have one time. I mean, it's if you can put it on your resume, then good. You know, it's good. It's like preaching. I remember when I preached at Riverside Church for the first time. I said, it's on my resume. You know, and nobody can never take it off. But I preached a morning session in 2000. I think it was 2004. Sujay Johnson, Ambassador Sujay, invited me to do the morning lecture, and then I think it was Billy Curtis' time that he had me on stage or something, and then most recently, I think it was the year before COVID, I did the lectures again. With the president, who was Riddick. I did. So 4 times I was able to be on the stage. It's a wonderful experience, but like I say, it's hard work. It's hard work, and you do want to bring something that's memorable. You want the people to know that you were there. And even now, I go around and people remember hearing me at Hampton. So,
tell me about your time of teaching, preaching.
I had 2 experiences teaching. I taught 3 years at my alma mater, Union, and then 10 years at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta. Both very different. Most of my students, I had African American students and European students at Union. Most of my students at ITC were African American. You know, it was different at Union because the African American students, and this is the case with, I find this to be the case with African Americans and students from other ethnicities, is that, you know, the kids who come to you from the black church, they preaching, you know, they've already preached, they've gotten affirmation from the congregation. They've gotten offerings, you know. So when they come to the classroom and you start trying to correct them, you know, you use the red pen and writing it. So you have a challenge there, you know, you have a challenge. But students from other ethnicities, most of my white students had never preached. They would, you know, they didn't know it. They wanted to be a preacher. They were taking preaching because it was required. They were open to what you taught, and you know, so you could they kind of absorb differently. Now that wasn't to say that the African American students weren't absorbing, but it was different because, like I say, if they, you know, if they had come from church on Sunday where they had auntie and grandma and the pastor standing up shouting, you know, it was hard for you to say that's really not a good sermon. And then, like I say, especially if they had received a check, you know, they gave me a big honorarium, you know, so how can you tell them? So, but we taught them introduction. I basically had to go with the curriculum that was established at Union. At ITC, I basically wrote the preaching curriculum. So I was able to do preaching as social commentary, which is a very exciting course for me. I did women's ways of preaching, which was my way of getting them to think, you know, womanist ways, womanist homiletics. Of course, they had to take intro and then intermediate. And so I had one course that I was very, very pleased with was the preacher as person. And so that was a very good course. And I had a very good, both at Union and ITC, I felt I had a very good rapport with all my students. Not 100%, you can't reach everybody, but it was exciting for me because when I began to see how very serious students look at the professor and how they'll begin to either mimic or imitate the professor, that was another level that I went to. I said, wow, you know. I said, because these people, some of the things they're going to do in the pulpit will be things that they either saw me do or heard me do or heard me teach. So that was another point of maturity for me. But ITC was a very good, again, it was challenging because I had 6 different denominations. Mm-hmm. So you had to wonder if, you know, the homiletical methodology was able to impact. And for the most part, I think it was. And where it wasn't, they would tell you that our denomination requires this, our denomination. And that's why I never, one of the things that was very important for me, for all my students, was to stay within your denomination and to use your own preaching voice. Right. You know, I mean, you know, if you're, whatever your preaching voice is, you know. And so we got along well once that was established, that I was not trying to make them into other than they were. Right. But I also wanted to make sure they understood who they were. So I required a lot of writing, mm-hmm. to which they complained vociferously. This is a preaching class, why we had to do all this writing? I said, well, because it's an important discipline. Yeah, it is. It's an important discipline that allows you to organize your thoughts. Because if it's not, you know, if you can't put it down on paper, it's not going to become automatic when you begin to speak it. I mean, if words are jumbled and you don't know how you're going to say them, they're not going to become fluid when you open your mouth. So I made my students write a lot and read a lot. And some of the books, many of the books they read were not books on preaching. I had them read, some, I introduced them to James Baldwin, Toni Morrison. I was somewhat surprised that they got through, that they could get to the graduate level without having been exposed to them, but they just weren't.
So did you teach which method, which means you can comment on your method, did you teach, which homiletic method did you teach?
Maybe the Knight method? I don't know. And what I'm saying is, I taught them what I knew. And I don't want to say that it was for me, I said start with the text. Because for me, what I would say in all of my classes is that all preaching begins with God. Because God is the original preacher. God spoke, so we speak. So I always, for me, the Bible is primary. So I say start with the biblical text, and they would start with the text, get your text, have the parameters of the text, the pericope as we call it, the parameters of the text, and narrow it down. And begin to ask questions. They would do word study, and then circle keywords. Know what those keywords mean. Know what those keywords are important to the sermon, because they may or may not be just because they're a key word or a big word or a biblical word that you can't pronounce. That doesn't mean it's sermon worthy or that it's going to be helpful or hurtful in the sermon. So know how you're going to use the words. Ask those questions. Again, what does it mean then in that text? What does it mean now? What is God up to in the text? One of the critical questions I always say, how are you going to move the people in this sermonically from where they are to the biblical claims that God is making? If you use this text, how are you going to get them? If this is what God is up to in this text, how are you going to convince people? And that's your writing style. That's your discipline. Are you a narrative preacher? Are you an expository preacher? Are you a textual preacher? Are you going to use one verse or multiple verses? Are you going to use a Hebrew Bible and a New Testament text? If you do, you have to do double exegesis. So that's adding to your time. If you use a Hebrew Bible text, how are you going to convince people, New Testament people, of the veracity of this text? Or how are you going to get Christ into a Hebrew Bible text? And I used to always say, remember, you're in a Christian context. See, I said the Hebrew people, the people who wrote the Hebrew Bible, they stopped there because that's what they knew. But we know about the resurrection. We know about Calvary. So I always felt that to stop and not preach, and that I would say, now that doesn't mean you have to go, he died and early. But how are you going to give a New Testament congregation or a Christian congregation the hope that we have in Jesus Christ using the Hebrew Bible? So I used to talk about, and I think we got this, I know we got this from Henry Mitchell, or somewhere I picked it up, that Christological bridge. How are you going to walk this text over from the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible into the New Testament? That's very important. And then how are you going to get them to apply it? How are you going to get them to live it out?
I want to do two questions, and then my first question is about the experience with Henry Mitchell. We were together in the Mitchell Wheeler Fellows, and of that group, some really marvelous and wonderful people. Got a lot of time to spend. So what did you most learn from Henry H. Mitchell? What?
From Henry Mitchell, I learned, and we must realize that my exposure to Henry Mitchell preceded United.
Yeah.
It came through Dr. Walker, because he was with Dr. Mitchell and in that group, and the Martin Luther King Fellows that they did up at Colgate, Rochester, and that group really is the forerunner, great grandparent of all this D-men work that's going on now, because those guys, Y.T. Walker, H. Beecher Hicks, Otis Moss Jr., Forbes, William J. Shaw, Harold Carter. I mean, that was you talk about dream team of dream team of D-men getters. But so because of that, I knew Henry and Ella well. Plus, they're both graduates of Union Seminary. So my exposure to them. So I had been walking, in their orbit or around them. For me, Dr. Mitchell's writing on African American preaching, and the book, I can't think of the title, but it is
Black Preaching?
And the Pulpit of Black Preaching. It's that small volume. I have that on my desk very near to where, where my preaching books are. And it's right at the top, even now. And I think that book came out in 77, 76 or so. So that, to me, now that's his most important book. Yeah. Just to me, that's his most important work. So I read Dr. Mitchell and knew of them. Dr. Walker would have them preach, and they would dress alike and then do the team preaching. And so from them, that was my first time seeing, tag team preaching when they preached, and when Dr. Walker had them at Canaan. And then just being able to hear him talk and hear him talk with Dr. Walker, and so when we got in the group, Dr. Mitchell, was just being Dr. Mitchell to me. He was the Dr. Mitchell that I already knew, and it was a continuance, so to speak, of what I already knew him to contribute and so forth. And I'm thinking, if I had some exposure to him, if he did some teaching at Union during my time there. I don't know if Forbes had him in as a visiting professor or what, but so again, my exposure to Henry Mitchell started way before, the United Group, yeah.
And of course, I connect the history of the PhD program to that, the Martin Luther King Fellows.
Right.
Because in United, I got to see a model, and last question. What would you like your legacy to be, or if you had to name your legacy?
What's really important to me, and again, it was something I said to my students, and they will tell you, our responsibility, and this, I say this to all preachers, your responsibility is to leave this preaching enterprise better than you found it.
Yeah.
So I want my legacy to be, if you can't say that I made preaching better, I want you to at least be able to say, I tried to make preaching better. That my commitment, that the effort I brought to every sermon I prepared was to make preaching better.
Yeah.
And to show a way of preaching without compromise.
Yeah.
I want it to be said that I didn't chase fads or trends, that the tradition of preaching. And if I can say this, Frank, I think the times that we are living in now are evidence of how necessary the traditional African American pulpit is needed. I just, and I know that, I know that people hear sermons and receive sermons differently and experience sermons differently in this fast-paced world. But I think the core of what makes preaching still needs to be there.
Yeah.
And we see so much happening and you can do it virtually or in person. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, I think there is some core elements to preaching.
So what is it that makes preaching?
Preaching is God address to humanity.
Right.
Preaching, it's what God wants to communicate.
Right.
It's what God wants to communicate to humanity, to God's creation, to God's world. And so it's not common. What makes preaching is it's God speaking to us. It's not what I want to say or my opinion or my thoughts on preaching. Preaching is what God wants to say.
Right.
And so in order for me to convey that this is a different type of talk, I'm not in the pulpit doing, I'm not there as a DJ or an MC or a news commentator. I'm saying I'm there as a representative. Thomas Long says, I'm there as a twice called person. I've been called by God and called by the congregation to speak on their behalf, and to represent God on their behalf. And so I come to the pulpit differently. I come with a seriousness. I come with an urgency. Because it is not Carolyn Ann Knight just saying what Carolyn Ann Knight wants to say. I ought to be able to say, this is the word of God. And they believe it, and it means something. And it means something. And I ought to be able to say it, and I say it, and at the end of it, at the conclusion of the sermon, your hope is that the people say, thanks be to God.
Well, thank you so much. That's a, you got a high standard we all shooting for, baby. And then when it is the grace of God that lets us meet it. You've met it in your preaching, and I am just thankful that you came and took this time to share with us. And we believe, as you said, the generations will watch this. And thank you for your contribution.
Thank you for having me. I mean, it was my honor. I mean, like I said, I don't know what I have to contribute, but
no, you got a lot to contribute.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, my friend, my friend, my friend.